Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your next session, Challenges and Confidence, sponsored by BC Iron. Please welcome to the stage Bob Wood, Director and Professor from the Melbourne Business School.
Thanks, Aaron. And that example of you must be 12, it's at one level, of course, it's a compliment, but when you're trying to be serious in the workplace, it's not. And I'll come to it later in my talk when I talk about one of the problems of low-level sexism and its implications. Okay, so what I plan to talk about in the time I have here, which I'll just get my timer going so I know what I'm doing. Okay, what I'm going to talk about is unconscious bias. And what I'd like to do is start by talking about what the term means and then go back a little bit and say, well, just give you some guidance on how we think, because that's quite central to understanding unconscious bias. And then what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about different types of biases and finish with a few strategies that you can use in the workplace. I might mention one of my colleagues, Rebecca Lee, has put this together, so it's a little summary that you can keep in the workplace. It's a very good thing because unconscious bias is often unconscious, of course, and so having something that primes it so you think about it is quite useful. And if you want copies of these to hand out, somebody will organise it, I'm sure, Rebecca or somebody like that. And okay, so what is unconscious bias? So let's just take the two terms. First of all, bias is a tendency to respond in a particular way. We do it all the time. Most of us have a dominant hand, and even if we're picking something like this up, we will tend to pick it up with our dominant hand, and we run around in tennis and the like. But it goes beyond that, right? Our bias in sports, for example, people often try to study other people's biases. Do they step to the right or the left, and which way do they turn? And at elite athletic levels, those understanding other teams' biases makes a difference. But then when we bring it down to our everyday lives, it includes things like the go-to people, the judgments we make about. We see a young female and we think, oh, she's less competent, or we see a black and we make assumptions about their ethnicity that which, even if it was true in the general, may not be true in the specific. So these are forms of bias. My daughter Daisy, who I actually wish was here, I didn't realise high school kids were going to be here. That's great. She will be next year. Gave me a great example. She was trying to understand this, and she said she's not a very psychological person. She's a science person like her mother, and she said sleeping is, she reckons, the best example. No matter where she gets into bed, she always wakes up in the same spot. So that's a bias, and as she pointed out, she's definitely unconscious when it happens. Okay, so that's the bias. Now, the unconscious part, let me illustrate through another example. I want you to think about the house you grew up in. Okay, got it? Now what I want you to do is to work out how many windows there were on the front of the house. Okay, so this young lady here, what's your name? Zoe. So let me describe what I observed with Zoe. Actually, the answer is not all that important to this exercise. What is more important? So Zoe, when I said about the thing about the house, she just sat there impassively, and I'm guessing it just popped into her mind. There was no, it was like if I said, what's 2 + 2? And I said, what are you thinking? You'd probably say nothing. That's unconscious knowledge. It's just there. It's unconscious. You have no direct control over it, and it's really fast. But then when I asked her about the windows, her eyes started moving, as did several of the people around here. And that's often a sign that we're engaging in conscious processing. And I suspect, Zoe, what happened is you started counting. You started thinking, oh, there was 1 on Mum and Dad's bedroom, there was 2 on the sleep out, there was 1 on the lounge room. Now, I suspect that's what most of you did. And my friends, that's how we think all the time. The first thing is just unconscious. It just happens. We don't actually control it. It comes out. We make judgments. These young schoolgirls, I can see here. You're in a schoolyard, and somebody says something, and you suddenly respond. And then somebody might say something, and then you start thinking about it. But that's how we live our lives. It's all of our expertise. It's how you drive trucks if you're Aaron. It's how you talk. It's just this unconscious processing, which is governed, is then topped out with the conscious part. But because we're aware of counting the windows, we tend to think that's what we're doing all the time, and that has some implications. Let me give you another example to illustrate another point about how we think. I'm going to ask a question. And I'd like you to shout out the answer as soon as you know it. What's the square root of 49? 7. Okay, so probably 100 milliseconds response. What's the square root of 64? 8. Okay, probably about the same. Now, what's the square root of 54? Sorry? Well, what do you reckon, this young girl in the school uniform? What are you guessing? Yeah? Okay, sorry to put you on the spot. Well, it's probably around about 7.5. So a couple of points I want to make here. First of all, a square root of 49, the square root of 64 are just like the house, or what's 2 plus 2. They're unconscious. They just pop out. So they're deeply ingrained. You've learnt them. If you haven't learnt them, you're not going to get there today, so don't worry about it, right? But the square root of 54, unless you're one of these people who just spends their life trying to learn such things, you haven't got it programmed deeply into your mind. And so therefore, you have to consciously start working with it. And what you do is you first of all go to this unconscious knowledge, just like the house. Square root of 49 is 7, square root of 64 is 8. It's somewhere in between. And you have to use your working memory. And what a lot of people start saying, oh, it's too hard, somebody else will answer it. Or you could take out your calculator, of course, which is another way to do it. And so the point I want to make is, once again, conscious thinking stands on the shoulders of unconscious thinking, and it's much harder work. And the most common response is to just pull out and just rely on your unconscious knowledge, even though it doesn't actually fit the situation. And that's often what happens. It's a sort of form of, sometimes it's described as cognitive efficiency, other times it's described as laziness. So that's the unconscious and the conscious part. And of course, all this is happening in our brain, but it's really stored in our long-term memory. And so what I want to do now is just leave you with a simple metaphor. We have two memories, which are like two thinking processes. And a really simple metaphor to think about them is a gate and a paddock. So the gate, as you know, is the entry to the paddock. And it's very small relative to this very large paddock. And the gate here is your short-term memory. That's where Zoe started counting windows, and where some of you who stayed with it started thinking, okay, 7 square root of 49, 8 square, I've got to hold those two, 54 is about, so that's all conscious processing, right? That's all happening in the working memory gate. And as I said, the gate's very small, and so it could be hard work. We have to do it sequentially. And if we get too much information at one time, we become overloaded. But everything has to go through and come out of the gate. So if the gate's closed, you don't learn and you often can't recall. And it gets closed for different reasons. So when Zoe, or it gets preoccupied. So when the burly miner says to Erin, you look like a 12-year-old, love. What's happening is Erin starts ruminating, thinking, as I think you said, you walked away thinking what I should have said and stuff like that. At that point, the gate there's something, the gate's being used, all her consciousness, and so she doesn't have access to a long-term memory. And so if you work in an environment where it's very stressful, where there's low-level sexism, you're more prone to make mistakes, right? Because you don't have easy access to what's in the long-term memory. Now, long-term memory is the house, it's the square root of 49, square root of 64. It's all we know about ourselves, it's what we know about our friends, it's our personality, it's our chess playing, it's our ability to drive trucks. It's all there. It's all stored in long-term memory. And if you organise it as you put it in, you're better able to get it out. So some people have long-term memories that are characterised as supermarkets. They can go to different shelves and take stuff out. Others have memories that look like Jones's junkyard, and it's quite, And once again, it's all a question of how you put it in. If you organise it when you put it in, something as simple as if you're reading a book, and when you get to the bottom of the page, just simply asking yourself, what was the main point, or the two main points, is an organisation process that improves your memory and recall later on. Okay, so now what I want to do, so we've got this idea, we've got long-term memory that drives it. Now, I just want to make a simple point. A lot of stuff that gets into long-term memory is put in unconsciously, and I'm going to illustrate that in a few minutes. Let me now just illustrate how fast some of this thinking is. Okay, with luck, this will play. Yeah, here we go. Oh, wrong one. I might need... oh, no. So what does one do here? Not that, definitely. Is there somebody, could you just hit the play button on that, the person down the back? Okay, so just watch this, just watch this. Okay, so what happened, Sabine Lisicki, this woman here, served this, right? At the time, it was the fastest serve in women's tennis. I don't know if it still is. It was 210 kilometres an hour. And this woman received it about here and hit it back. Now, here's a calculation for you. At 210 kilometres an hour, a tennis ball is travelling at 58 metres a second. Tennis court is 23 metres long. That means from the time from Sabine Lisicki's racket to when this woman sighted it, moved, lifted her racket and hit it was 400 milliseconds. Now, if you want to get a sense of what 400 milliseconds is, look at 1 second tick past on your clock and then divide it by 2 and take off another 100. It's a very short period of time. This is played at a subconscious level. This woman is not, and interestingly, I've learned from this, so we do very complex things. We play violin, we play tennis. If you and I were doing that, we started thinking where she's going to serve, the ball would be past us. You know, the time it takes us to think where's she going to serve. Interestingly, I've learned studying this, most amateurs, when they're playing tennis, watch the ball being served. Who does, if you play tennis, do you watch the ball throw up and hit it? Is that what most people do? It turns out professionals don't do that. They watch the hips. The hips are actually much more indicative. If you're an amateur tennis player, I can tell you, just trying to do it doesn't work either, because you're still looking at their hips and the ball's behind you, right? So, okay, how are we going here? Hold on, let me just check my time. Okay, so that's one. Now, the next one is to illustrate something. So what I'd like the person out there, could you just, one at a time, this is a very simple exercise. I'm just going to play, these are songs from the noughties, the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and I want you to listen to the songs, just a small part, and just if you can recognise the name of the song, the artist, or if you know the lyrics, sing along. Okay, so could we start with the noughties one? Can you turn it up? Okay, so there's a bit of movement in the room. Look, slightly younger age group moving, right? Okay, so let's go to the 90s. Let's go to the 90s.
I can eat my dinner in a fancy restaurant, but nothing, I said nothing can take away this blues, 'cause nothing compares to you.
Okay, so I noticed some of the younger school students there are looking, saying, what's that, right? You clearly weren't alive in the 90s, right? So let's go to the 80s. Okay, so everybody, you would have had to have been dead for the last 20 years not to have been indoctrinated with that song. Okay, now let's go to the 70s. Now this is the acid test, literally. Okay.
If there's a button in your hedgerow, don't be alone there. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen.
Okay, so who recognises that song? Whoa, okay. Now, those younger people in the audience, you should get to know it. It is, besides the fact that it's Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, it also happens to be the song that is most often voted #1 in top 100s. Well, it was up until about 2000. It's probably losing its... So I just want to make a few points, right? How many people were able to recognise all 5 songs? Oh, sorry, 4. Yeah, 4. Okay. So what are you putting your hands up for, right? So, well, okay, 3. Okay, 2. Okay, and then 1. Okay, so very now I'm guessing that the people who recognised all four were probably people who are slightly older and people who recognised fewer younger. Now, but that's not the main point. The point I want to make is this, and that's because we're exposed. We listen to music quite intensely at different periods of our lives, and we learn it and we retain it. 30, 40 years later, Stairway to Heaven. We know it, we remember it. If it was a song like Lola that came out when I was a kid, right, which was the first song about transsexuals, and people were singing it until somebody said, "Do you know what that's about?" And you're saying, "What?" And then it got into all sorts of discussion. And so as a result of that, you know that song much better than you might, like Stairway to Heaven, you know better because people talked about it. Now, one of the reasons why we learn this stuff is one, it's repetition. Let me tell you, if they banned all music off radio and read poetry, we would be reciting poetry. I know it's hard to believe, but it would be. That's what happened 200 years ago. People would learn to recite poetry, and you could. I've made this suggestion to the ABC, but they don't seem to be getting with it. I can't even get my kids on board. The second point about it is it's relevant. So it's relevant to us. So we learn it because it's repetitious, it's easy, and it's relevant. About 90% of rock songs are about relationships, about love and relationships. If it's country and western, it's about cheating men. If it's the blues, it's about cheating women, and then there's a bit of true love in there. So the point is, the point I want to make is a lot of what's in our long-term memory is just there. We don't consciously put in. It's not just what happens in school. It just happens in life. We learn things. So if you operate in a society where there are not many female leaders, you start to develop stereotypes about what leaders are. Okay, so let's move along. Now, here's a little exercise. I want you to write down the two missing numbers. So write down the two missing numbers. Imagine I'd come to you and said, look, I need to paint these two numbers in. This is a picture of the clock, could be off London Court or the University of WA. So, basically, they're just, I mean, it's not one of those, but I've looked at them and they're both basically the same. Okay, so what would I write? What would I paint up here? Yeah. X1, okay. And what would I paint down here? 1V, okay. Now, so what's your name? Alicia. So let's imagine Alicia's my daughter. She's been off to university, she's pretty smart, and I'm a painter, uneducated, and I say, look, Alicia, I've just been offered this by the city of Perth to repaint these because they've been defaced. But the problem is, I really don't know if these, I've got no idea what's there, but it's, so I've got to put up a surety of, say, $10,000, but the job is I'm going to be paid $40,000. So do you advise me to take it? Yeah, okay, great. So you're confident about that. And everybody confident? Okay, so let's look at this. So just have a look at this number here, right? Now, if you have a watch with Roman numerals, look at it now. Does anybody in the room have a watch with Roman numerals? Oh, come on, there's got to be somebody in this room. Okay, so what does it have? That, right. And you probably thought 1V. Now, I want to make 2 points about this example. A lot of the knowledge that's stored in the paddock is just wrong, right? As it turns out, if I'd asked you the question, what's the Roman numeral for 4, you were exactly right. It's 1V. But it turns out most clocks, about 90%, 92%, have 4 ones on them. You can Google it and find out why. I don't have time today. But the second point I want to make with Alicia is, see, the judgment gets lost in the process. I'm now her dad talking to her and saying, you're confident, dear, and she's saying, yes. Yeah, there's a bit of a self involved. This is how unconscious bias works. It happens. It's not as though you see it and you say, that's unconscious bias. It gets mixed up in judgments. And I'll give you an additional example. We do a lot of work with the New Zealand police, and there was this case where a group of young Maori, a suburb called Devonport, it's a very upmarket suburb in Auckland across the bay. And so a couple of police officers sitting in their car, and they saw these Maori youth going around the corner of a very fancy house, and they jumped up and ran over and said, what are you doing here? And then the Maori men told them to F off, and then it got into a scuffle, got taken back to the police station, and it turns out one of these Maori men had some connection with the woman in the house, and so the next day everything is police are racist. Now, at the request, or my request to the Assistant Commissioner, because we were over there, I went and met with these two men. Now, a couple of things come out. First of all, they were at pains to convince me they were not racist. You know, they played rugby with Maoris, their best friends, and so that was one thing. And I accepted that. The second thing is they had no idea how their initial judgment contributed to the event. They saw it all in terms of the reaction of the kids rather than their initial judgment, you know, accosting them. Now, the kids, of course, have a history, if you're a Maori, of being stopped by police. So you start to develop a mentality that is not cooperative now. And this is how it works. Our unbiased judgments get lost in the process. And so we don't see the impacts of them. And I'll give you some more. That's a very important point. If every time you made a biased judgment you got a shock, just a 40-volt shock, you would very quickly stop making them. The problem is you don't get the feedback. Okay, so here's the point. So unconscious bias, it's fast, it's low effort, and it's easy. It sort of captures our intuition of situations, and most of the time it's right. However, it can be bad. It can lead to prejudice, discrimination, unethical decisions because we focus on what we know and we ignore the complexities of the values. And, it can be badly wrong. So let me now just talk about a couple of types of bias and then strategies. First, the mother of all biases is what we call confirmatory bias. We go to incredible lengths to protect the knowledge we have in the paddock. We read newspapers that support our point of view. We speak to people who we know we're much more comfortable with. So we hang out. So there's very, very strong confirmatory bias. So people will cite evidence. When I was talking to these police officers in New Zealand, they said, look, Bob, you have to understand, a Maori kid's, 5, 6, 8 times more likely than a Caucasian kid to commit a crime. And I said, do you think that's wrong? They said, yeah. And I said, well, then why don't you go around arresting policemen? Sorry, not policemen, arresting men. And they said, why? And I said, well, men are about 50 times more likely than women to commit a crime. So on that logic, you should be arresting men whenever you see them. And their response, oh, that's not relevant. But it is, because what they don't understand is, even though Maoris do commit crimes at a high rate, a very small percentage of Maoris actually commit crimes. And because men commit crimes at a higher rate than women, a very small percentage of men commit crimes. And so, but the evidence confirms what they believe, so they want to believe it. And I think they probably rejected. At that point, I think I became an academic, sort of thing that they say. So, okay, so confirmatory bias, very important. You'll see this in conversations, and it happens that you will be talking about, why is Joe good for the job when Joanne's not? And they'll start peppering on examples, and they'll be highly redundant examples, and nobody asks, well, why might Joanne be better for the job, or why might Joe not be good? Why don't they do some risk analysis? Ask counterfactuals, which I think Denise mentioned earlier. Okay, so that's confirmatory bias. Do you read, I just did an example of this, of how expected. I was on the plane coming over here, and because I travel a lot, the stewardess said, oh, Professor Wood, and we'd been on different, and she said, oh, would you like a paper? And I said, sure. And she said, what would you like? And I said, the Herald Sun. She was taking out the age. And, she just assumed I was a stereotypical, sort of left-wing academic. And I said, no, I've read The Age. I want to read the Herald Sun. And she was clearly surprised, because most people don't read, across the two different news companies. So that's confirmatory bias. The second one is stereotypes. Just have a quick look at this. What springs to mind when you read this? Okay. So this young schoolgirl, when you read that, what do you think? I mean, without trying to overthink it. Don't know? Okay. Well, that's good. That is good. Okay. What about over here? Well, make me do it this way. Who in the room, most people, when they read this, will think she's a librarian. And the reason for that is because, and it's great to think that the young people didn't immediately jump to that, right? It says something about age and experience. So your answer is a great answer. That didn't help my presentation. I have to make that at that point. The reason is because that's written to characterize the stereotype of a librarian. And so there's just this quick matching. So we have stereotypes. It's like women and leaders. We tend to think of we've done a lot of research using cognition, this unconscious knowledge measure, and people associate leadership much more with male traits than they do with female traits, and that has implications. As it turns out, Susan is much more likely to be a lawyer simply because of the fact there are many, many more lawyers than there are librarians. And if you start unpicking it, practical reality, structure, those are things that you might want in a lawyer. But our stereotype of lawyer. Now, where do these stereotypes come from? They're like the songs. If you're not exposed to these types of leaders, and recently Meryl Streep was talking, she was giving an inaugural address, and she referred to some of the work that had been done at UCLA. Apparently, 92% of leaders in movies are men. And the women are predominantly what she referred to as Cruella de Vil types. Do you know Cruella de Vil from 101 Dalmatians? She's mean and stuff. And of course, Meryl Streep was talking about her role in the movie Devil Wears Prada. So there's not a lot of positive role models. Now, you sit in the movies and you're watching this and you're not assuming that this is influencing your view of leadership. Trust me, it is. It's simply... eating disorders are largely related to, there's a very strong relationship to presentation of people in magazines. People don't read that consciously thinking, I'm going to absorb, they think I want to be like that, but they don't think about the consequences. We absorb stereotypes over time, from the newspapers we read and all that. They're not all the product of personal experience. But then when you add in the confirmatory bias, when you start seeing somebody who you start looking for evidence that proves the point of view, just like the police officer saying, do you know? So they cite that fact, even though it's not relevant, because it confirms what they have in the paddock and it justifies their action. Okay, now, can I just make a point? Just labeling somebody as being introverted. So Zoe, let's imagine you're going to be interviewed by somebody here, and they ask me, what's Zoe like? So look, she's great technically, but she's a bit shy and a bit introverted, and the person interviewing might think, oh, there's a bit of a union representation role here. Now, just by my saying that Zoe's introverted, when she's interviewed, what will happen is the person interviewing her will leave less time for her to answer questions and will make more interjectory remarks. So what happens is the preconception influences what you see and what you attend to, and so they come out of the interview saying, she'd be good, but I don't think she can do this part of the role. The reality is, I made a summary judgment of her. Zoe was actually trying to think of answers while the person was waiting for the question, but we fill in. So if we think people are introverted, we tend to talk more, and we fill in, and we don't give them the chance to talk. Okay, so next one, very quickly. This is, I have to say, the fact that my daughter Daisy is going to go into industry, this bores me. So there's very strong stereotype that think leader, think male. I can't go into all the research, but it's on our website if people want it. That means, let's imagine Alicia is going in for a job interview, and she's come to me and she said, look, Bob, I've read all your research, and I realise that if I act like a woman, like if I'm compassionate, empathetic, and all that sort of stuff, I'm going to get rated down as a leader, and trust me, you are. Even if you've got exactly the same record and all that, that research is really unequivocal. So she says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to act like a man. So, okay, so I'm going to be more consistent with the male stereotype. And now, let's be clear what this means. So this is from the research. So Alicia comes into an interview and they say to her, look, I noticed when you're at the Geraldton site, there was a bit of a team that wasn't working and you did something. So she gives a female answer. And the female answer is, well, look, when I turned up, there were two people who were unhappy. Things weren't working. So I sat down with them. One of them was having a lot of strife at home, so I counselled them, and they basically moved on. The other person, they just got into a conflict in the team, they couldn't let it go, so I transferred them to Kwinana or something like that. And then I sat down with the rest of the team, we formed we had a strategy day, we formed a plan, and we discussed it, and then we all started working together. Now that's very feminine. It's empathetic, it's concern for the person, it's collaborative. Now, she could answer as a male after reading this other research and say, well, look, when I arrived, the place was a shambles. I got rid of two people, they were just not performing. I then sat down, took them on a strategy day, outlined a plan, and we all worked together and I held them accountable. That's much more male-type language and stereotypical. It's autonomous, it's me doing it, it's assertive and that. Well, if I say that as a male, I get rated as being a very good person. However, if Alicia does it, she's counter-stereotypical. She's behaving like the leader stereotype, but she's not behaving like the female. And this is what happens. First of all, compared to a man who says exactly the same thing and has exactly the same record, she gets rated higher on competence, but she's seen as very dominant. You know, it's like, whoa, you know, she walks out of the room and she's good, but God, you know. And then look over here, you know, this is, you know, I don't know, and the question of fit comes in. You know, she's going to be tough. You know, look, I think this team we're thinking about probably needs somebody who's a bit more compassionate. And so she compared to the male, she doesn't get hired. I have to tell you, my friends, this effect, this is from research by Anna Janat, is really strong. Think of Julia Gillard. You know, Julia Gillard was operated in a male stereotypical way. The political world, she was a good political operator, and she just got persecuted. I once went on I was on the 100 Women of Influence channel, and I went along, and she gave a talk. I'd never seen her live, and I was amazed. First of all, she was funny, quite self-deprecating, and she had quite a soft voice. Now, everything I'd heard on television was this, they would keep playing these things over and over. I must tell you, I was totally shocked, and she was really hilarious. Now, I'm not talking about her policies or anything. I'm simply saying she's a woman playing in a man's game, and so this is a non-trivial issue to think about. Okay, final one. I'm just going to, when you start adding these common mindsets up, then it becomes groupthink. And then it becomes quite difficult. I'm just going to quickly pass over. One of the things we've learned is putting women in solo status in groups adds a double burden. They have, trying to require women to carry the burden. So one of the things we recommend is try and create a critical mass. You need a very supportive team leader, and you need one or two people if possible. Sole operators carry quite a heavy burden, whether it be a racially sole operator or a gender or whatever. So, and groupthink, in mining industry, groupthink is very strong. It's very functional in the sense that everybody gets pulled together and they're collaborative and they support one another when there's risk. The problem is when times start to change and you need to be adaptive, it becomes a liability. Okay. So just very quickly, a few strategies. First of all, if you want your colleagues, and I'm clear I'm talking to the wrong audience here, but we're all subject to bias. First of all, slow down your thinking. Take some notes. Use tools. I'll give you a very simple example. A SWOT, just forces you to write, and it's like if you're listening to Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Way of slowing down your thinking is try and think about, look, there are 3 parts to it. What's the first part about? What's the second part? So just try and, going back to Denise's point, use some self-reflection. Think about, the task and, try and imagine when you're in a meeting, just slow it down in your mind and say, so, who talks the most here? How is it organised? Taking notes. This is, recording is a great way of slowing down your thinking, and it organises what goes into long-term memory. That's one. Okay. Second one, and this was ask counterfactual questions. Now, you do this all the time. It's called risk analysis, due diligence. So if you're ever going back to Stuart's, I think, example, if you have the 2 people rated on his thing, one's a 7 and one's, let's say, a 6, let's say it's close. One of the questions you can always ask, and I think it's fantastic, well, no, actually, let me say the example from Iluka, which I was so impressed with, I have to tell you. I think it's just like Southwest Airlines. They take the view, select people for values and train them for skills. Now, that's a counterfactual, that came from counterfactual thinking and saying, well, just because we've always done it this way, this is what the paddock tells us we should be doing, can we do it another way? And I imagine the initial responses were, oh, well, it's not going to work, they won't have the skills and all that. But you think it through. So it's this counterfactual, well, why not? What if we do it differently? What if we hire Alicia? What would we need to do to make it work? So these are asking counterfactual questions. Well, why do you think that? Or why not? Now, be more inclusive. Now, this is very quick point because I'm running out of time. I've got 3 minutes. So this is from our research. Now, inclusion is an interesting thing. It's as simple as when you run a meeting, going round and doing a round robin, asking each person to talk, and doing it frequently enough that people feel confident talking, and shutting down the people who criticise who other people who talk. So managing the meeting is... we've done this with companies. The participation engagement ratings go through the roof. That's what it is. That's what participation... But there's a couple of more higher level abstract points I want to make here. Often when we're dealing with... we've dealt with a lot of technical and engineering companies, people talk about social inclusion. They talk about the fact that the boys go off to the rugby or the AFL on Friday night with the guests and all that, and we get left out. Now, it turns out that's what we call social inclusion. That's not the big problem. The big problem is task and information inclusion. And let me illustrate this. I think I mentioned my wife Sally is a professor of mathematics, and she used to be in a department where every day about midday she would hear the head of department walking along saying, "Jack, coming to lunch? Bill, coming to lunch? Sally's office. Shh. Frank, coming to lunch?" That's social exclusion. That doesn't bother her. What bothers her is the next day when Frank comes in and says, "Oh, Sal, have you seen the teaching schedule?" And she says, "What? I'm teaching Wednesday nights. Bob's teaching Wednesday nights and Jack's got clarinet." So she goes to the head of this, and he says, "Oh, no, I'm sure he spoke to you," but he hasn't. And so this is information exclusion. And that's what, from our research, that's the very thing that really bugs women. That they feel it's just that it happens at the social thing. It's not that they want to go to the rugby and we should all be going to the ballet. All those things are good. It's more about the information exclusion. And one, I'm just wary of time. One other thing very quickly. This often happens. Liz Broderick has a saying, if you don't consciously include people, you may be unconsciously excluding them. And this happens in task allocation. And I want to give you a simple example. I'm going out to meet a client. And I'm thinking about it. I'm about to, I'm thinking, they're going to be, I've called Sal and said, look, I'm going out to meet Bill. They'll be drinking and smoking, so I'll probably come home, my jacket will be smelling, and I'll be late, and I'll probably be a little bit wobbly by the time I get home. And so I'm about to say to Zoe, grab your coat. And then all this is bounced around in the back of my mind, the stereotype, young woman, And so instead of saying, Zoe, grab your coat, I say, Jack, grab your coat. Jack comes out and he's a hit. And then over time, Jack becomes my go-to person. Zoe starts to feel less confident around me. She's not, and when I'm asked later, when they come up for promotion, I'm saying, Jack's absolutely fantastic, gets it, is really good. Zoe, I think she needs more development. Now, let's be clear what has happened here. Jack and Zoe, both been recruited under the same graduate program. Their development merely reflects their task allocation opportunities. So if you have men in your department have go-to people, try and challenge them to allocate around the developmental tasks. We have a law firm now where they have to keep a record of the files that they allocate. And I'm just out of time, but I just want final point I want to make is this. Just joking is something we have to stop doing. Because if I make a sexist joke, like you look like a 12-year-old, Erin, and then you take offence and then I say, I'm just joking, it's a double whammy, right? And so she's then ruminating and thinking about what I should have said. Everybody else gets a free kick. Everybody else thinks, oh, Erin, stop banging on about it. Bob was just joking. But if Erin is ruminating, and we have evidence from one of our industry partners' remote sites, women are having a higher frequency of small accidents, injuries and that. And we think, we don't know yet, but we think it's related to this low-level sexism and I'm just joking. So the women get doubly isolated. You get hit by the sexist joke and then the isolation because you don't have a sense of humour and other people don't want to engage. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.